Okay, so thanks to Wendy for organising and providing the space for the launch, and also to the ODI for giving CALP the opportunity to co-edit this latest edition. And of course, thanks to the panelists and of course the audience for making the time to contribute to discussions today. So this latest edition of Humanitarian Exchange is just but the most recent fruit of collaboration between the CALP and the Humanitarian Practice Network. As Wendy said, we collaborated last year on the Good Practice Review on cash in emergencies, and this was very much a joint piece of work co-funded by the CALP, and the CALP acted as a steer of the work as well. So the Good Practice Review identified a need for continued research and learning on a number of areas, and on themes such as scaling up. It argued that experience with implementation on cash at scales is starting to accumulate, but lessons really need to be documented and evaluated. Now, Degan Ali from Adesso sort of takes some of this up in the latest issue of Humanitarian Exchange, when she talks about the cash-based response in Somalia, where by March this year, more than $70 million US dollars had been distributed to beneficiaries, making it the largest cash-based response ever implemented by NGOs. But what Degan also argues is that risk aversion had a role in sort of hampering the response, which led to unnecessary delays in implementation. Now, what the GPR also identified was a need for agencies to sort of continue to embed cash in standard operating procedures and business processes. Now, this is something that's taken up in the issue as well by Nupur Kokredi and from Oxfam and Rosie Jackson from Save the Children, where they relate some of their experiences about institutionalization in their organizations. Now, one of the key recommendations they pull out is that, as in any process of widespread organizational change, management buy-in is really crucial. Now, the Good Practice Review also identified a need for humanitarian actors to be able to sort of make decisions about when cash is appropriate or not. And of course, part of this is building the skills and capacity for market analysis. Now, Sarah McHattie speaks to some of this and more in her piece on response analysis, in which she explains how the growing use of cash in emergencies has really made us more conscious about the importance of good response analysis. And the tools that we've started to develop as a sector to guide modality selection have really highlighted the importance of better analysis of context, of needs, of markets, and household preferences than is currently done by organisations. So CALP and the Humanitarian Practice Network are of course keen to keep abreast of latest developments and new learnings. So this issue is somewhat of a check-in of some of the issues raised in the Good Practice Review. So, of course, Sarah Bailey of ODI and Brianna Ridstill, formerly of the CALP, and who's helpfully joining our discussions from Nairobi, co-edited the piece. And there are contributions from the CALP Steering Committee member agencies, as well as the broader cash community of practice. So where are we at now? Well, cash, of course, is being used more and more in emergencies, though, of course, few interventions match the scale of comparable in-kind responses. A recent exception, of course, is Somalia, and hopefully Degan will be able to give her perspectives on this. So the lead article written by Brianna really sets the challenge: bigger, better, and faster. She identifies 3 core areas that we really need to address if we're going to use cash effectively, particularly at scale. This is market assessment and response analysis, preparedness, and also coordination. And she also makes the case that, you know, if we're really going to reach the full potential of cash, we need to reach that holy grail of working across sectoral boundaries. So the issue then picks up on some of these themes, as well as some other key areas, including the use of new technologies in cash. And we're fortunate to have some of the authors here, and of course a highly experienced audience to contribute to some of the discussions and pull some of these themes out. So for the CALP, since the launch of the Good Practice Review last year, we've embarked on and released a number of key pieces of research, all of which you can access on the CALP website. One is really appropriate for today's discussion, and that was a piece on the preparedness of humanitarian actors to design and implement cash at scale. And this sort of looked at existing procedures, systems, and guidelines, as well as technical capacity, contingency planning, and coordination. And there is a suite of recommendations made for donors, agencies, and the broader community of practice. There was also a piece on market analysis and emergencies, and this piece explored how market analysis can strengthen interventions and what is needed in terms of information, time, and capacity to actually do this market assessment well. Again, there's conclusions and recommendations for future areas and needs in terms of investment. We also did a piece on new technologies in cash, and this research explored preconditions for the use of technologies, user friendliness, accountability, and the potential for wider impacts of technology. So it looked at e-payments, use of mobile phones, and digital data gathering tools, sort of outlining current use, benefits and issues for beneficiaries, key lessons, constraints to their uptake, and also ways forward for the sector. And we also developed a toolkit on urban programming in cash. And this toolkit brought together sort of best practices and key programming issues, and also adaptations of methodologies for the urban setting. It also contains guidance and tools that can be quickly adapted for use in different settings. So in terms of the next phase for the CALP, up to 2015, we have a strategy also available on the website that really speaks to some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, and that's institutionalization, information analysis and market assessment, coordination, and of course going to scale. So for this, CALP will continue to work on its three sort of core areas of expertise. So that's building skills and capacity, coordination and information and knowledge sharing, and research and evidence building. Although in this phase there's going to be a bit more of a focus on global advocacy to really start to catalyse change. Training's also going to continue, but there's going to be a shift more towards institutionalising skills within organisations rather than just training individuals to really start to embed some of the skills and knowledge needed to implement cash. Also, we'll be embarking on more research to help support emergency preparedness and contingency planning for scale. There's a few ideas that have been floated, and we'll finalise this through consultation with the community of practice. The areas that could be explored are market assessment, so putting into practice some of the results and issues from the earlier market assessment research, and that would need coordination and link up with other members of the community of practice that are doing similar work in terms of trialling sort of one-day tools, this kind of thing. Also looking at cost effectiveness of cash, so trying to determine the factors and conditions under which cash is or is not more cost effective than in kind, and also scaling up and linking to social protection systems. So looking at sort of what institutional arrangements promote rapid and scaled response. And this would include an analysis of social protection systems and see sort of how well adapted they are for emergency response, and how to create interconnectivity between shorter and longer term assistance. There will also be learning events and case studies sort of built around the themes we're going to be discussing today. And of course, forums such as these are really important to sort of discuss experiences and key issues. And on that note, I'll hand over to Wendy to get things started.
Thanks very much, Hayley. I think that was a really good overview, and it's really interesting to hear about all of the future work that CALP has planned. Okay, let's start. I'm going to start now by asking a few questions. Let's delve into some of these issues that Hayley mentioned in more detail. And I'm going to start off with asking our Brianna and Callum in particular what they see as the main barriers to scaling up or implementing large-scale cash transfer programs, especially when there's no pre-existing cash program. Brianna, do you want to start, and then maybe Callum can comment?
Looking at an environment where cash transfer programming has been done on a large scale, both by NGOs in Somalia, but also by governments, for example, in Pakistan in 2010, and also in response to Hurricane Katrina in the United States, for example. So we are looking at a framework where we know that it is possible to do cash transfers at scale, yet we're not yet seeing these being systematically implemented as much as in-kind responses. And it's also important to recognize that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. There are definitely contexts in which large-scale cash transfers are not the appropriate response. But in a context where all else being equal, cash transfers could be used at a large scale, I think that there are still some key barriers in the way to scaling out cash transfer programming. And I look at these in terms of practical barriers and then also in terms of political and policy barriers, and I think it's important to make that distinction. On a practical scale, I think that the lack of preparedness and investment in preparedness is something that is really holding us back, and that means that we don't have the experience, the confidence, and the skills across the teams, especially the teams that are on the ground when an emergency occurs or at the onset stage of a crisis. They don't yet have the skills to even assess whether large-scale cash is feasible or to implement those programs if necessary. And that's not just the technical people, that includes the decision makers, that includes the finance staff, that includes the logistics staff as well. So we're lacking the skills and confidence, we're also lacking the ways of working together within organizations and across organizations. And some of that points to a need for a buy-in at a management level and just for greater awareness and commitment to implementing cash as well as in-kind responses. And I really don't think we're there yet, especially at field level across most organizations. Market analysis and response analysis is another key area that for me is very practical, that we're still lacking the frameworks to do cash at scale. We have a lot of market analysis tools now that are designed for using after the onset of a crisis, but we are still not at the point where we're able to rapidly and effectively get the quality of data that most people feel is needed to implement large-scale cash responses. So these, as we call them, quick and dirty tools might be enough for small-scale responses and pilot programs, but I don't think that they are going to be sufficient to access the resources, the funding, the human resources that are needed to implement a large-scale cash transfer programming. And then finally, on a practical level, coordination is critical. It comes up in all of the discussions, it comes up in all of the resources, and there's a link back to preparedness and also back to response analysis when it comes to coordination. And I think the thing that we have yet to see work effectively, despite the efforts of people like Adesso in Somalia last year, is to have coordinated decision-making happening early on in a response. We get together after the fact, and in many cases that means that decisions have already been made, funds have already been committed, everyone's working in their own corner, and just trying to pick up the pieces later in terms of coordination. So that initial coordination is really critical for me. Perhaps I'll hand over to Callum to look maybe more at some of the policy level barriers.
Great, thanks, Brianna.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I haven't really got very much more to say because that was pretty comprehensive. Just looking at it from maybe a donor perspective, and I think that probably varies hugely. I think ECHO is and I would say probably differed in this case, but I'll have to speak for ECHO, is very open to cash programming. It's very much part of our policy environment. There was a communication, an EU communication on humanitarian food assistance, which incorporates cash program, cash and vouchers, as well as in-kind assistance in terms of food assistance. So I think ECHO is very open. The door is open. There is no boundary in a sense with ECHO. But that's not the same of all donors. And there's still quite a lot, I believe, there's still quite a lot of resistance to change with many other donors. Even when some donors are talking about cash and supporting cash, when push comes to shove, it comes down to in-kind assistance. Even if it's cash to buy in-kind assistance, if you see what I mean. So there's a bit of a double thing going on, I think, in the kind of donor environment. I was going to also just maybe mention something which Brianna has already sort of touched upon, was coming to scale. A lot of it seems to be around having sufficient preparedness in emergencies, and I know we're going to touch on that a little bit later. So giving confidence that you can do cash programming is a lot to do with preparedness. Is everything in place, in a sense, on the ground to be able to do it? Or is it actually going to pose risk to agency staff, or the actual money that's being transferred, is it going to get stolen or whatever? So I think, you know, an awful lot of it comes down to preparedness, and I don't want to go on about that because I know we're going to deal with that a bit later. But around sort of risk and donor confidence, I think that's one of the key issues that we still probably need to deal with. And as cash is still relatively new in large scale, you know, that will take some time, I think, to come on board. Yeah, I think that's really all I was going to add.
Okay, great. Thanks, Callum. Yeah, I'm going to ask Tim, who's with DFID, to see if he has any comments to make, and then I'm going to move on to this to explore this risk aversion issue, and with Dagan.
Okay. Yeah, you know, despite our great reputation for being leaders in cash, I mean, DFID really is still struggling to put policy into practice, I would say. And we are heading on a route now where we are going to be doing quite a lot of evidence gathering. And one of those pieces of work is very much looking at institutional blockages. And I think one big barrier for us is implementing partners. I mean, when we're doing food aid, you know, we kind of know who to write the check out to, and you know, sort of what's going to happen with it. When it's in a context where we don't have other mechanisms, you know, where we're going in a new area like Haiti, it's very, very difficult to know who to go to, who to talk to, and how to get the program in place quickly. This is particularly in a big onset emergency. I think we're more knowledgeable in the slow onset, and I think that where there are the mechanisms, I think we're going to talk about that later, but I think that's a different context. But I think that where we want to really start drilling down and getting some good evidence and good knowledge is the big onset, big bang, and getting cash out the door fast.
Thanks, Tim. Dagan, I want to move over to you. I mean, you wrote an article for us about the situation in Somalia in 2011. And if I understood correctly, basically you said that there was a long-standing and large evidence base with respect to cash transfer programming and a clear and urgent need, I mean really urgent need. Yet it took many months for the humanitarian community to employ cash transfers, you said, as an alternative to food aid. Why do you think this was so, and what do you think we need to do to try to avoid such situations in the future?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think one of the main issues that contributed to risk aversion was around the counterterrorism legislation and the issues around diversion. So I think that had a lot to do with people's reactions to cash, especially after the UN Monitoring Group's report in 2010 on diversion, alleged diversion that had happened with in-kind. So I think that created an environment really of where confidence, even though we had been doing cash in Somalia since 2003, there had been extensive amounts of trainings done of NGOs. I would say Somalia, between the market situation and the capacity of the NGOs, far surpasses maybe Kenya and certainly South Sudan. But at the same time, the risk was there, and I think had a lot to do with people's analysis of the situation from this view of the issues of diversion. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that sometimes humanitarian decisions are being made through the lens of security and political interests. So I think that had a huge impact on the case of Somalia. But I also think that there was a lack of understanding on the part of leadership about the potential for cash. There wasn't enough technical know-how amongst the cluster leads. There wasn't enough technical knowledge amongst the HCT. There wasn't enough technical knowledge about this from OCHA leadership. So all around, it was basically just a few NGOs talking about this and one donor, primarily ECHO, and very little mass, engagement at the larger level. And this is what we were trying to do by asking the HCT to recommend this at scale. So I think the fact that people didn't understand that the markets were working very well in Somalia, this was the right environment to do cash and scale. They didn't understand the availability of the hawalas, the money transfer companies. They didn't understand all these things, and it was very difficult to convince them that it's relatively uncomplicated to do cash in Somalia. It's not the big monster that it comes across. So I think that had a lot to do, the counterterrorism and security concerns and just lack of technical knowledge. And then also the third, going back to coordination, the fact that cash is multi-sectoral and didn't have a home in any of the cluster meant that there were no allies really within the cluster system to push this agenda with us. So it was, like I said, a few people, CALP and us and maybe ECHO around talking. And so it's the same, we were preaching to the converted. We weren't able to preach to the larger groups of actors out there.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, some important issues there around humanitarian leadership. And I suppose it would be interesting to know from some of the other panelists what they think, what can be done about that. Are we not communicating as well as we could do with the leadership? Are there other things that need to be done? I'll go to the Nairobi panel first. Bree, Glenn, Callum?
Sure, I'll field the first part. I think looking at leadership and coordination around cash transfers, what we're actually missing is a neutral lens, a neutral body. Someone within the likes of OCHA, they're not implementing programs. They don't have a stake in trying to garner support for a specific program. They don't have a program of their own that they're trying to run, so they don't have to wear two different hats. This was a challenge we faced looking at Somalia last year. The intercluster efforts for Somalia, they ramped up, and ultimately it was FAO that took the lead of this intercluster effort, but again on a part-time basis, mainly due to the fact that they ran their own cash programming, so they had a horse in that particular race, so to speak. You need a neutral body like OCHA to take that lead and push that forward because they have nothing else to gain. The CALP, we were able to push the agenda because we didn't have a program implementing anything inside Somalia, but without a higher level within Geneva, New York, Rome to help us push that forward and help build the internal technical knowledge within OCHA to actually understand what they need to do to coordinate things, to move forward, to look at some of the common humanitarian funds, what to do with those, and are they able to use that money for cash? All of those different things have implications on whether or not someone can and willingly will take the lead. We're missing that neutral body. Ideally, I believe it would be OCHA, and we're working on that with them as we speak, try to develop that ability to actually coordinate cash transfers.
Thank you. I mean, talking about coordination, and I mean, you're talking about needing a neutral body in this sort of situation, but I suppose looking at more stable contexts, there's also an issue around, because coordination around cash transfer programming in emergencies is handled within the humanitarian aid architecture, the cluster system, there are other actors, aren't there, such as the private sector and development actors who aren't necessarily involved in that, or there isn't a clear sort of avenue for involving them. And I just wondered if some of our panelists might want to speak a bit about that. I was going to turn to Tim in the first case.
Okay. my other job is very much around the DRR, disaster risk reduction, disaster resilience agenda, and I just feel that the cash transfers is such a joiner between humanitarian and development programming. And I just feel that there's a sort of bifurcation between, humanitarian discussions and development discussions. When you're talking about programs for fixing problems, and be that stress or shocks, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the safety net experience. And I think we are doing, but I think that there's a long way to go. And I think that the case has been made in a lot of the sort of more chronic discussions, development discussions with governments about, sort of social protection, pension schemes, and all these sorts of things. Also, in the way that they're delivered as well, I think that we are moving very quickly and very swiftly with the new technologies, innovations, and I think private sector has a real role to play with delivery of cash. And be that the card system, be that the constantly pulled out mobile phone system, but also banking systems as well. I mean, I think that it's a really good way of actually building structures and banking networks as well. So if you are actually designing any sort of safety net or social protection program in a development context, I would say that within that design criteria, you should be looking at what sort of shocks and stresses might be out there and have those sorts of design factors built into that, so that your program working in a normal long-term environment can then switch if other things happen. And there are examples, Sri Lanka post-tsunami, of these sorts of things happening. I think that's the way to put the pressure.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Now, Callum, I wonder if ECHO has a different perspective on that.
Well, actually, I concur exactly with what Tim was saying about with the social protection. So I haven't
Come on, Callum.
Sorry. Sounds a bit sort of vacuous, but I think there's massive potential for humanitarian aid to go through, or food assistance to go through social protection mechanisms. And I think the risk financing element of the PSNP in Ethiopia is a very good example of where social protection program can expand and contract to take on new caseloads in the case of shock or increased needs. So I think there's massive opportunities out there. One of the interesting things, just from specifically an ECHO position, is, and we haven't really worked out what to do with it yet, but it's the whole kind of humanitarian principles and independence. Because of course these social protection mechanisms are run by governments, or have a very big government role in them, if not actually run by them. And that does actually compromise ECHO's position on independence. So that's one of the things we're going to have to struggle with, I think, over the next period. But certainly massive opportunities.
Great. And while I've got you there, Callum, I wonder if you could, let's move on to response analysis a little bit, since this is what Sarah McCarthy covered in her article. And I wonder if you could just tell us what you see as the gaps in terms of response analysis. I mean, where do we need to improve in terms of cash transfer programming specifically, and humanitarian programming overall? What do we need to do?
Yeah, well, I first of all start with humanitarian programming overall, because I think there has been a tendency over many years to do increasingly sophisticated needs assessments and situation analyses, and then everybody goes away to their respective offices and do what they've always done without any response analysis. And I think that's been a classic problem with humanitarian assistance over the last, forever, probably. So I think good response analysis, which is all about helping us as donors and agencies to determine whether we're doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. So we've got to try and focus on. In terms of gaps, and specifically looking at cash programming, I think there's been quite a preoccupation in a sense on doing good market analysis, which is very good. You don't want to go into a situation and cause massive inflation, especially for non-beneficiaries who are going to suffer from inflation, for example. So I think that's been an obvious and a good move, and we've got some tools on the table. I think perhaps what is missing on just the market analysis side is actually putting those together in a more cohesive way. So we do have two principal tools, the EMMA and the MIFIRA. It's not that one is better than the other, do slightly different things, and I think that's good. We need tools in the box rather than just one tool. So I think, I know Calp has done a little bit of work on this, but actually looking at what tools are available, making them as good as they can be without getting too institutionally sort of biased around it, is one challenge, and actually designing tools to meet different needs is something else. And just for one example, we talked about scaling up earlier. You know, there's probably a need for you know, a fairly robust market analysis if you're doing cash at scale, rather than the kind of slightly more rapid but less robust analysis such as within Emma. So, you know, there are different, it's not that Emma's not good, it is, but it has a different, slightly different function. So I think that's one of the things. I think perhaps the other things is that we kind of focused an awful lot on the market analysis, which is fine, but I think as Sarah wrote in the paper, that we need to broaden out and look at you know, a real good understanding of community and household dynamics. How does cash get shared around, for example, or not? Because my feeling is that cash actually gets shared an awful lot less, for example, than in-kind food assistance. So how does that actually work? Looking at the gender issues around sharing and also around women or men receiving cash, for example, is that an issue? Protection concerns are quite important as well, I think, on all of that. And then not forgetting, of course, that you know, the whole point in cash is to empower people and to make choices and so on like that. But to have households and individuals making their preferences known, whether they actually want to receive cash or vouchers or in-kind assistance, is also important, and we sometimes forget about that.
Thanks, Callum. Dagan, I wonder if you have any further comments to make on that.
Yeah, two things. One, on the social protection issue, I just wanted to say that, you know, that it's a great idea, and that's the ideal scenario, but in fragile contexts like Somalia, Haiti, we don't have social protection programs. So, and yes, we hope to have social protection programs, but then we have the situation where a lot of donors are saying, no, you can't do social protection where there's no strong functioning government. So until we address that dilemma amongst the minds of the donors and see that social protection is actually, in the end, more efficient and maybe even less expensive than doing large-scale humanitarian programs at a time of famine. So I think donor policies has to change around their willingness to do social protection in more fragile contexts. On the response analysis, the other thing I would like to highlight is that, you know, we did have FSNAU, we did have FuseNet in Somalia, but everybody was waiting for them to give the green light to whether cash can be done in scale. And I actually think that that was not a good thing. I think there's an over-reliance on big institutions, and agencies have kind of, you know, not developed our own internal capacity on market assessment. And actually what I think we could have used best is a very simple, easy to use market analysis tool in the field. Something like Emma or Mafira is almost impossible to get done in a place that's remote access. You have to bring field from South Central, the logistics. It's very difficult and it's very expensive to do. And you don't have the luxury of that time. So something a little more user-friendly, I think, is required. And I don't think it has to be as complicated as an Emma or Mafira. I actually think we need to simplify the market tools.
Okay, thank you. Bree, did you want to add anything?
I think this is a really interesting discussion because I think Callum and Deegan have just illustrated the contradiction that is going on in terms of humanitarian policy and practice at the moment. And there is this really big question around market assessments, and some actors are calling for more data, more detail, more comprehensive understanding of market systems in order to do cash at scale, whereas other actors are saying, well, you know, we regularly implement these massive social safety net programs without any kind of market analysis whatsoever, so what's the big deal? Why don't we have something that is more simple? And, you know, why is the absence of this really complex technical analysis preventing us from doing cash? And I think that that's tied into risk aversion as well, in that sense that it's easy to constantly justify and say that we need more data, we need more evidence, we need more tools, we need fewer tools. And yet you do have these contexts in which you have all the data, you have all the evidence, you have all the tools, and we still can't get a green light and go ahead and save lives. And I think that point, you know, Deegan makes that point really, really well in her article. I don't think that there's any clear answer in terms of what is needed to address this question, because I think part of it is coming on the practical sense. I think that preparedness is really critical here, and that means investing in local capacity. It means investing in understanding markets before a disaster happens, as well as trying to develop tools to understand them after the onset of a disaster. It means building in-house or local capacity instead of relying on international technical experts that have to fly in to do an EMA or to do a MFIRA, which takes weeks, if not months, of preparation and planning, and also takes vast financial resources, often to deliver a result that is not to anyone's satisfaction. And unfortunately, we've seen that with quite a few market assessments in the last couple of years. So there's really a need to maybe break away from that approach a little bit and try and figure out what it would take in terms of local capacity to get us to the point where we could at least give a green light to cash transfer programming. And I think a final issue is looking at flexible funding modalities. And I think, Callum, you raised this issue that we go out, we do response analysis, and then we come back and we do the same old thing as always. And what's happening with market assessments is because they need so much planning, preparation, organization, and funding, they're almost duty-bound to justify the response that we thought we would do in the first place. And that's linked in a sense to funding. You know, what happens if you raise $15,000 to do your EMA and it comes out and says, actually, you shouldn't do the program you had in mind for which this funding was secured? So we possibly need to look at ways of having, you know, an interim market assessment or having pre-existing market frameworks or pre-existing criteria that give us the green light to start doing cash transfer programming if appropriate, while we develop our longer-term programs. And that requires more flexible funding, and it also requires that critical and elusive link between, you know, relief, recovery, and development funding and programming expertise. So it's a really complicated question.
Yeah, no, they're very interesting points that you've raised there. And I'd like to pick up on something a couple of you have alluded to in the discussion so far, and this is on whether our institutional systems and whether our systems generally are fit for purpose when we want to engage in cash. And I'm going to ask Haley if she could talk a little bit about what makes institutionalization of these systems and processes difficult. And what do we think are the must-haves, you know, the success factors for institutionalization to actually start to happen? We've got an article in the Exchange which focuses on this. One of our authors is here, Nupura Kakreti, sitting here. So Haley, do you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess some of the sort of challenges that I'm sure you must all be familiar with is, you know, this idea of sending someone off to a training, whether it be for EMA or a MFIRA or a cash training in some cases, that they don't always filter down when that person or people return back to the organization. Sometimes, you know, the skills are held in one person or in one team. And, you know, the fluidity of humanitarian organizations means that that person might move to another organization taking that knowledge with them. And of course, funding institutionalization and sort of organizational change. I mean, this costs money, and it's not always easy to get funding for these kinds of processes. Now, Oxfam and Save the Children have some recent experience of trying to institutionalize cash in their own organizations. As Wendy said, Nupura was one of the authors of this piece, and also Rosie Jackson in Save the Children. And now what they sort of spoke to was, training is not enough. It's just one part of a process. Also need to have a look at skills development beyond some certain technical areas, so taking it out of the food security and livelihoods team. Also tools and procedures are really important, and a sense of sort of developing preparedness, so having cash focal points, starting to have these discussions with sort of financial service providers and things well in advance of response. So for Oxfam, they developed this financial standard operating procedures, and that was developed in concert with one of the senior finance managers. And for Save the Children, they developed a set of cash SOPs. And that was done with the logistical team, with operations, with finance, and also with the food security and livelihoods team. It included some sort of standard risk and cash feasibility assessments. So I guess what came out of that experience, which I think is really important, is, there's no set formula, but there are a bunch of sort of success factors that you can take away. And the first being, it's really important to find sort of internal advocates, particularly advocates that might not necessarily be in, the usual suspect sectors. So in the case of Oxfam, they found someone in the finance team, who had a lot of respect in the organisation and who could help drive through the process of developing these guidelines. It's also important to sort of seize opportunities to demonstrate effectiveness. So in the instance of Somalia and Pakistan, because they were large scale, this was an opportunity to sort of demonstrate effectiveness. Senior managers were involved in approving projects, so they had to know about cash. Educating widely is also really important. So making sure that people across teams understand what you're talking about, so the knowledge isn't just kept within one traditional sector. Also training lots of staff at different levels is also really important. So you've got management buy-in, also so you've got different technical sectors who understand and can implement programs. And also management buy-in is really key to sort of push forward acceptance and take on sort of new skills, new capacity. But also importantly, it needs funding. This stuff costs money. And it's not always easy to get funding for institutionalisation. So it'd be good to see donors sort of be more willing to fund something that's not exactly sexy, but really, really important.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the issues too is that many of the big organizations that deal in cash, the institutional setup is set up for, in-kind distributions. And so changing that around is a big issue. And I think this management buy-in also speaks to the whole leadership issue within the sector in a number of different ways. So you have to have that leadership across the sector, across the humanitarian community in situations such as Degan was talking about. And you also need that within your own organizations, a clear sort of position on that and ability to move forward. We're going to go on, I think, with a couple more questions for another 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up the floor to the rest of the audience, because I'm sure you've got some either questions or comments that you'd like to make. I had one that I wanted to, we mentioned new technologies, and Tim said, i.e. mobile phone technology. There are a few others as well. But these are innovations that are being taken up more and more by agencies, expanded, developed. And we've got a couple of articles in the Exchange which talk about these. But it's interesting because the authors of those articles have different perspectives in terms of the role that innovation plays. And I wanted to ask Tim and Callum in particular, but other panelists can comment as well, that one author makes the case that a donor challenge fund for mobile money in Haiti encouraged innovation in cash transfer programming, and it actually encouraged the development of longer-term solutions to various problems and development solutions around giving people access to money, especially poor people generally, not just people who were affected directly by the earthquake. And that it is possible to innovate in the midst of a major large-scale humanitarian crisis. One of the other authors suggests that this donor pressure for innovation is actually has a negative side to it too, in that it can discourage agencies, because it's a competitive process, discourage agencies from sharing information and approaches and ideas or working together. And so I just wondered if we could ask Tim first what his perspective is on that, and then maybe Callum can chip in.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I mean, I think, again, there's so much that we can learn from things that are out there at the moment and being used in our sort of, everyday long-term, sort of perspectives. And I think that it's how you can actually develop these sort of, tools, innovations to work in a humanitarian context. I think that's kind of where the gap is at the moment. And moving money around, I mean, nobody moves money around better than private sector. I mean, bankers who don't have a very good reputation at the moment, but, sort of banking systems, that's what they do, and they do it on a very large scale. I mean, the Visa the Visa example in Pakistan is just so impressive that the amount they can do, and it's getting the checks and balances in place before an emergency. I think right in the middle of a big emergency, there's relatively little space for innovation. I think that you can roll things out and things that are pre-prepared, if you like. But you can't play around with people's lives, and I think that's a big problem when you are talking about research and innovation in a humanitarian context. You don't have the time. Usually, it's a case of if you do something wrong, then nasty things can happen. But I think there's a lot of stuff that can be programmed. I mean, the reason the Pakistan example was so successful was the fact that a lot of the population had been pre-certified, so people kind of knew who people were and where they were, and it was just a case then of rolling it out. So I think context is very, very important. I mean, sort of where there are very sort of weak banking systems, you're obviously in a very different place, and then you might need to use mobile. So I think you need to have a lot of different tools in your back pocket, if you like. And I think that the time to sort of look at innovation is from learning from an experience and then looking at how things could have been done later. And of course, it's very close to DFID with the HER, where we're looking at, sort of innovation in emergencies in a much broader level, but we're doing quite a lot of work around cash transfers in emergencies under our innovation strategy. So we're going to be doing more and more of that in the future.
Do you want to say a word about this study that you've just completed about looking at the cost?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I wrote down here about sort of, championing and getting it in is you need to make the case. There's a sort of, we think there's a value for money story in cash transfers, versus, sort of flying food around. And we feel that there isn't a lot of evidence being gathered about, the extra value of cash versus the extra value of NFIs. And also just simply tracking cash. We don't really have markers for cash. We've got markers for shelter, markers for food. Cash is difficult to sort of find out what you're doing. We've just completed a study in Kenya and Ethiopia, which is it's called the economics of late response versus building resilience, and it was taking 3 different scenarios, and it was really on the back of a lot of the stories about we responded late and it was more expensive and all this sort of stuff. And so we've done some economic modelling in Ethiopia, Kenya, in a pastoralist scenario, looking at how much did the late humanitarian response cost versus counterfactual modelling of what would it have cost if we'd have gone in when FuseNet made all their sort of October, November, whatever it was. What would the cost of that have been of taking stock off the land, feeding stock, doing sort of less intensive, food programming. And then the third one was an attempt to try and do a costings of building resilience, and that was kind of the tricky one. That was quite a difficult one to do. But the modelling was done around the household economy approach. So the data's there, and it was just sort of taking those 3 scenarios and trying to look at it. And the figures are just being published, and it not surprisingly, but intuitively we know, but we're actually trying to put some sort of facts and figures to that. And I think within that story there is also a very strong cash story as well, that if you can go in quickly, early with cash, people will do other things, people will have their choices, and people, the third biggest spend of cash transfer programs is in education. I mean, that's amazing, and we don't really think about that when we're sort of looking for NFIs and what about a big education program or something like that. That's what people are spending their money on.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We'll look out for that. Now, Callum, did you want to add?
Yeah, just chip in a little bit. I think the whole kind of debate around innovation should be to maximise efficiency at the end of the day, is to get cash into people's pockets as best as it can be done. And I think that's the positive thing about the innovations, is that generally speaking that is happening. But I think we also need to look at some of the other potentially negative things. I think Pakistan was actually quite an interesting example, because although it's very innovative and it was very successful in many ways, there were also quite a lot of exclusion errors. And if you started to look at who was excluded, it was often more vulnerable women who were excluded because they didn't have ID cards or some other reason like that. And that's, so I think, sort of going along a kind of almost a dogmatic innovation approach, or through a particular innovation, you have to really, really make sure that there aren't people who are missing out for some reason. I think there are other issues as well, like data protection and confidentiality. There are all sorts of issues around those sort of things with electronic systems. I know this is one of the issues within the HSNP in Kenya, which I think has been dealt with quite successfully, but it's just another one of those things to think about. Yeah, I mean, I would still sort of go along with Tim in the sense of saying the preparedness is so important with many of these things. You can't, and it's just the same as Degan was saying, in a situation like in Somalia, you can't have a very sophisticated system, but the Hawala system worked very well in Somalia. So, there are some very simple things that you can do very effectively. And security is obviously a prime concern in that kind of environment. But in places like Kenya, I mean, the HSNP in Kenya will be registering every household in the area where it's operating, whether they receive a cut. Now that presents a huge opportunity as well for us to expand and contract that with pre-registered beneficiaries, which is very interesting. Also, I think with that smart card technology, it also brings the possibility of load a whole range of different sorts of cards. So it could be the simplest cash, but it could also be a health treatment for a pregnant woman, for example. She could go with her card to the local clinic, and if they have a point-of-sale machine, then she could get a treatment for something. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can do with these things. So it's definitely the way to go. It takes work and preparedness to do it, but I think that is also something, certainly in the more predictable, slow onset type emergencies, that's the sort of thing that we can put in place when there isn't an emergency, which is in fact what we are doing.
Thank you. Okay, we're running a bit short of time, and inevitably we haven't been able to cover everything. But I'm going to ask the people who haven't spoken recently, Degan, Glenn, and Bree, to give us any final comments that they have before we open the floor. And if you could keep those as brief as possible, so that we can leave time for questions and comments from our audience. Shall we start with Degan?
I think my only comment is just to say that it wasn't easy, but we learned a lot from the Somalia experience. And I think the biggest learning came from the fact that we can do it if we can do it in the most insecure environment, one of the most insecure environments in the world. There's no reason why we can't do it in scale in other countries. So that's a major challenge to us. But I think that another thing that we have to keep in mind is that, even if it wasn't 100% successful, that the humanitarian imperative to respond outweighs any kind of concerns or issues around diversion. Even if our success rate wasn't great, but I think that we shouldn't lose confidence, and we shouldn't demoralize the NGOs if by bashing them, if the findings and the external evaluations and all of these prove to be not 100% successful. So I think it's a cautionary note that we need to keep that level of confidence going, and a lot of negativity and punitive kind of judgments are not. It doesn't help that environment.
Thank you. Glenn.
I think it stems back to what Tim had made a comment on earlier, is that we're not alone in this anymore. If we strictly consider cash as a tool, it's not just the humanitarian community that needs to be involved. it's the private sector, it's well beyond what our normal realm of what we do for a living is, and it involves a lot larger number of people. Some of the solutions are already out there. Visa, for example, a credit card company, they provided one of those solutions in a very large response in Pakistan. Solutions can be achieved, and we just need to find additional key stakeholders out there to help us achieve those.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Brianna.
I guess really every time we talk about cash, we do end up coming back to the same old refrain, which is that what we're talking about is really about good humanitarian programming. And when we talk about innovations and we talk about using new technologies, these are things that are not just affecting emergency cash transfers. These are the things that are affecting the entire spectrum of relief to recovery to development programming. And the world around us is changing, and the way we do aid is changing, and cash is a very small part of that, but it is a part that seems to be pushing us, so it's on the forefront of this wave of change. And I think that's why it remains something that is generating all this discussion and is really interesting. It pushes us to work in new ways, it's opening us up to work with new partners, the private sector has a role, we're looking at doing humanitarian programming on a different scale and in different ways than we've ever been able to do it before. And I think it is forums like this that need to keep happening. We need to keep this agenda of learning and keep this agenda of open dialogue between donors, implementing agencies, policymakers, and governments in order to keep moving this agenda forward and just to make sure that we are able to deliver the best humanitarian aid possible. So thank you for providing the space for us to keep doing that.
Thank you, Bree. Callum, I know you just spoke, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I wasn't expecting that.
Or I can come back to you. I can come back to you while you collect your thoughts. Okay. Tim?
Yes, I think just something else to add is that I think that as we sort of edge our way into this, I think that there are some sort of ways of doing it which will be more conducive to our partners and to donors, and I think that's doing a mix of cash and NFIs. So we've talked about going in with a shelter response, and sort of the shelter response could go with a sort of $50 bang next to it as well. And so we attach it to things that we are able to do at scale and put cash in there as well. And then I think that you can give, part of what is required. I know the evidence from the Ethiopia Safety Net program is very much that people are asked, do you want cash or food? And they can't get both together, and that's what people's preference is. They would like to get a mixed basket of cash and food. And I think that we could look at that, and I think that would be a quick way of getting a few sort of, quick wins in this.
Thank you. Hayley?
Yeah, just a couple of short things. First, I like that there's talk about, innovation being driven by needs rather than falling into a trap of innovating for innovation's sake. I mean, we saw in Oxfam's response in Turkana, actually the most effective way to get cash out to people was not using, mobile networks, A, because they're a little unreliable, and B, it just wasn't feasible in the short term, but actually using local traders. So, again, it sort of just comes back to really good analysis and really good sort of understanding of context. And I guess I like there's a lot of discussion about preparedness, and there's a really big role in that, in sort of a need to invest in producing and disseminating evidence around cash preparedness. There's some really good stuff going on in Philippines, for instance, at the moment, where cash is actually being sort of pulled into the formal coordination system, so into the humanitarian action plan, into the HCT contingency plan. So, these are some really good opportunities to promote preparedness, but we need to know, how these things worked and, share the learning.
Right, and last but not least, Callum.
Well, I haven't really got very much to add. I think everybody said it. I just think it's if in the situation where you do have these social protection systems set up and good preparedness on cash and other other forms of assistance. It's, you know, I think we really need to look at how this is going to revolutionise the way we do business. I mean, other people have said it in that, but I think it is actually incredibly fundamental. And I don't think, speaking for ECHO, I don't think we've actually, apart from one or two people, have really thought about it. And it's, I think that's what needs to happen within ECHO, for example, is to actually take this on board and really analyse it and work out what it means for a donor like ECHO in the future. Because it is, as Glenn was saying, it's working with all kinds of different people, including governments and development actors, rather than just operating on our own kind of thing. And it's a very different kind of mindset, really, for many people to get to come to terms with.
Thanks very much.